Hello and thank you for joining in on today's training. Heart & Solutions is a proud provider of CE-eligible trainings for our counseling community. This training may be eligible for continuing education credit hours through either the National Board for Certified Counselors, provider number 7376, or the Association of Play Therapy, provider number 21-645. To obtain CE hours for today's training, be sure to follow the steps in the description below to find and take your quiz.
Welcome to another episode of You Need a Training. In today's episode, we will focus on tough caregivers, obstacle or opportunity. We have an interactive introduction to emotion-focused family therapy. Today's training is presented by Bryn Miller, and in today's training, we get to focus on emotion-focused family therapy. And so we are so grateful to have Bryn with us today. As all of you know, working with individuals struggling with mental health issues is unique, rewarding, and incredibly demanding. Given this intensity, it can feel overwhelming to tackle the involvement of loved ones, especially if they present as highly anxious or overly critical. Regardless of a provider's training, discipline, or experience, sticky situations are likely to trigger an emotional response, even for the most seasoned providers. Emotion-focused family therapy offers a language to help providers and teams explore these normal, expected, but sometimes problematic responses to triggering clinical demands. So in today's presentation, Bryn's going to offer us an experiential introduction to EFFT clinician blocks with the goal of bringing more insight and empathy into your work with parents, caregivers, and loved ones. Bryn's going to offer ways to incorporate approachable language when discussing clinical struggles with peers, colleagues, and supervisors as well. So, Bryn, thank you so much for being with us today. Many of you may not know Bryn, and so I want to take a second to just highlight what an incredible gift it is to have Bryn's knowledge and expertise with us today. Bryn Miller is a licensed professional counselor in the state of Colorado, a certified eating disorder specialist and consultant, and a certified advanced therapist in emotion-focused family therapy. She is also on the advisory board of the Colorado Eating Disorder Professionals Group and supports parents and caregivers through volunteer work with the nonprofit The Eating Disorder Foundation. With nearly a decade working with adolescents and young adults with mental health issues alongside their parents and caregivers, Bryn is passionate about supporting both individuals and their support systems. Bryn approaches her work both with individuals and their loved ones with the goal of whole family healing. In service of the mission to better support parents and caregivers, and inspired by EFFT, Bryn founded Bryn Miller Parent Coaching and developed her signature 5-step parent coaching program, the Response Roadmap. Through live virtual groups and her on-demand course, Bryn empowers parents to get calm, confident, and connected to both their children and the parents they want to be, regardless of the struggles. When Bryn is not working, she is writing, meditating, embarrassing herself in a hip-hop dance class, and trying largely unsuccessfully to keep up with her own 2 small children. And I think we all can find a bit of ourselves in those accolades as well. So Bryn, thank you so much for being with us today. I know I'm incredibly excited to learn more about EFFT and so grateful for your willingness to share your knowledge with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Colleen. I appreciate you sharing all of that and getting all that background info to everybody. And I'm just thrilled to be here. I love bringing this work to people that are supporting individuals who almost always kind of come with caregivers, with loved ones, with parents. This work has really changed the trajectory of my work and the way I hold space for families and sit in session and even just sort of conceptualize the work. And so it's been such a gift to me, and I get so excited when I get to bring it to other people. So yeah, I'll just go ahead and jump right in. Thank you for allowing me to be here. Thank all of you for the work that you do. It is not easy to do this work in this space. And it's just so important. So I'm really grateful for your willingness to be here and desire to learn and figure out ways to continue to support parents and caregivers. So my background, I'm an adolescent eating disorder therapist, certified eating disorder specialist, they used to call it, and supervisor, now consultant, and have about a decade of doing this work with families. Also have that expertise in parent support and skills through the advanced certification in emotion-focused family therapy, which we'll really dig into today. And I feel like this is just so important that I am a deeply imperfect provider and parent as well. So when I talk through this, when I do this work with people, I always want to just name that I am coming from a place of always learning, continuously humbled, both by, the work I do as a provider and the support of parents, but also as a parent myself, that no one has this all figured out. And so very much from the idea that we are in this together, and these are skills that I continue to use and sometimes forget to use. And so just coming from a place of I'm in this with you, which I feel like is always so important to name. So what to expect for the training today? I'm really kind of obsessed with efficiency and effectiveness when I'm working with providers, but also with parents and caregivers. There's just not enough time in the day. And so I want to drill down and make sure you're getting tools and skills that are very actionable. So in service of that, make it interactive. So whether you're here in person or if you're watching the recording, grab a pen and a piece of paper. The more that we can actually start to kind of use and put these tools into place as quickly as possible, the faster we're building these muscles. That being said, you do you. I want you to honor where you are today. Go as deep as you feel able to. Take a break if you need to. Take a few deep breaths if you need to. So a huge part of this work, again, whether it's with providers or with parents, is getting you back connected to what you need and what's going on for you in the moment. And so please honor that. And know this is just a taste. We are just scratching the surface. And if you like it, great. There's a ton of resources that I'll have at the end, resources for providers, but also resources you can pass along to families as well, too. So just kind of a, important thing around language in the training is that EFFT was really designed to be used across the lifespan. So I use the term parent and caregiver kind of interchangeably. And when I'm talking about a child, I'm referring to a person of any age. This child might be 50 and the parent might be 80, right? But the child of the parent or caregiver. So again, really thinking about this, from talking about really, really small children all the way through adulthood, but that we're talking about this relationship of a parent or a caregiver to their child, not a child necessarily. So here's what happens with providers. You're interacting with emotional parents or caregivers, and you have feelings about it. Totally normal, happens to all of us, myself included, and our feelings get activated. When that happens, it's really easy for us to go into some knee-jerk patterns. And then we often are not the provider that we want to be in these really tough moments. So if this has happened for you, you're in good company. Welcome. The research shows, and this is research that was done specifically in eating disorder work, but the research shows that it was clear that the decisions that were related to the involvement of family members in treatment were perceived to be the ones that were the most emotionally charged, not for the client, not for the parent, but for the providers and for the team, especially when this involvement related to critical or dismissive parents. And this is some really interesting research that we have in EFFT that just helps us kind of articulate and put words to the fact that as providers interacting with parents and caregivers, there's so much that comes up. There's so much that's coming up for the parents in seeing their child struggle. And then there's so much that happens in the relationship between the provider and the parents or the caregivers. And that these decisions, especially around involving the parents, are very emotionally charged in the team. And even in eating disorder work, just sort of using that as an example, more charged than setting weight goals, more charged than talking about meal plans, all these things that we know are highly activating in those situations. And that it's really the parents and the interaction with the parents that people felt the most unsure about, the most activated about. So in service of really kind of getting these tools into your hands, think about a case or a client or a situation that's come up recently that you're struggling with. And I want you to imagine that you're using this case to kind of ground yourself in this work today. So again, whether you're here live, you're watching this, on a recording, really give yourself permission to kind of think about a spot that you've been in with parents and caregivers in particular, and ground yourself in that case so that we can work through some of these tools in a way that it will generalize to the work that you're doing. So sometimes people write like initials right at the top of their page, or a name or a situation, but just one of those spots that you've been in where you're like, oh, I've got that email from that parent sitting in my inbox and I don't even want to read it. I don't even want to look at it, right? Or gosh, I'm feeling so frustrated with this set of parents. I've asked them to come in and they're not coming in and the communication isn't there, and just a case that you're noticing is sort of kicking some things up for you. So give yourself some permission to kind of take a moment, ground yourself in a case if you have. So when you think about this challenging case, when you think about how the caregivers and the parents are showing up, especially in the ways that makes you kind of want to maybe do this or like, what are some of the behaviors that you're seeing? Are they showing up in ways that you can see? It's kind of clustered around this tree here. And this tree is a tool that we use in emotion-focused family therapy, and we'll talk through it a little bit more today. But that oftentimes when parents are struggling with their loved one struggling, they can show up in these ways that we as providers can see as tough. And that's kind of, why I call the training like tough caregivers, right? And I put that in quotes very intentionally. And we can see these behaviors as an obstacle. And it's really normal and natural for us as providers to see these as obstacles or barriers that are sort of getting in the way, sometimes getting in the way of the work, getting in the way of the treatment, getting in the way of the communication with the parents or the caregivers. So just give yourself a minute to think about this case, or maybe even other cases where some of these behaviors might be coming up. The parent is showing up as really critical of the child, right? They're coming in and they're saying things that almost kind of make you cringe, right? Like, oh, they just aren't trying hard enough, or they're just not motivated, or they just don't care. And that might not jive with what you're seeing in the sessions, in the rooms with the child, right? You might have parents that are really avoidant, where you're like, come in, we need to have a session, or I need to talk to you about this. And it's just crickets. You're just not hearing anything back, right? We've seen those families in denial, where you're, okay, we've got to talk through how are we going to make these changes, or even giving parents a diagnosis, for example, and just that way that the denial can kind of show up. Sometimes this looks like accommodating or enabling. You're saying, okay, you have a client that's doing OCD work, for example, and you're like, okay, we got to do these exposures at home, or we're setting these goals. And then the parents come back, they're like, well, we didn't want to do that, or I didn't really want to push them too hard, or it just seemed, even though maybe you talked through it in the session and they were totally on board, right? This can show up as other blaming often. You can see, my child's dad or mom, they're the ones that are doing X, Y, and Z. Sometimes this is blaming of other providers. Often this can be coming towards us as providers, like, well, why didn't you do this? And why didn't you do that? And we can get really defensive in the face of that, right? And so just sort of thinking about all the ways that parents and caregivers can show up that feels really challenging for us as providers, that can feel like such an obstacle, right? It can feel like this thing that's getting in the way of treatment. So just take a moment as you're thinking about your case, jotting down some of these things, like, oh yeah, they should, like, it's avoidant, or they show up as accommodating, and kind of putting words to it. So in emotion-focused family therapy, we believe that caregivers are a crucial part of any support team. That when a parent gets support and skills, their child is better off, period. And there's a few different ways that we sort of conceptualize this. But whenever I'm meeting with a parent or a caregiver, again, regardless of the age, we could be talking about a 5-year-old, a 15-year-old, a 25-year-old, or a 55-year-old, especially if they have a relationship with their parents and caregivers, that there's so much that can shift in the system when the parents get support. That being said, we know that caregiving is really, really challenging, that parenting a loved one with an eating disorder or any kind of mental health issue, this data that I'm going to talk about here is pulled from eating disorder work, but that EFFT is really broadly used in all mental health issues, even in preventative parenting. We're getting it into schools. There's a million ways we're using it. But I thought that this data, this study came out just last year, and I think just really hits on how challenging it is for parents and loved ones who have children that are struggling with any kind of mental health issues. So this is a study that came out of Australia, and that they saw that parents with children and adolescents that have eating disorders have 96% worse than normal psychological health. They have 70% worse physical health. We have 93% worse romantic relationships, and only 14% reported a helpful experience with the first provider that they were working with. And most families saw an average of 3.5 therapists before finding one that they felt like could really help. So part of this is just really creating that space and that empathy of, by the time you have a parent or caregiver that kind of crosses your threshold or comes into, brings their child in and is working with you, that often this is a picture of where they are. This is what's happening for and I'm not even talking about the child, this is what's happening for the parent or the caregiver, in terms of their psychological health and their relationships. It also talked about the number of days off, that these families will often have to take over the course of a year, the wages lost. There's incredible stress that comes along with this, that really informs how a lot of these parents and caregivers are showing up. And being a caregiver is really activating. So in EFFT, we believe that there is no such thing as an unmotivated parent or caregiver that just doesn't get it. We believe that parents have an incredible superpower. And so when parents show up in ways that feel problematic, in ways that feel like barriers, in ways that feel like obstacles, our goal in EFFT is to really look underneath. Because when we can start to leverage the love, the care, the motivation that a parent or a caregiver has for taking care of their child, regardless of how they're sort of showing up, that it's the closest thing I think we have to magic when it comes to doing this work, both in terms of helping the quality of life for the parent and caregiver, but also the loved one. There's some cool research that they've done with EFFT where we actually see a reduction in symptoms in the child when we work exclusively with the parent or the caregiver. And this is also what we see in, there's a great program called SPACE as well, that's all about parenting for, supportive parenting for anxious childhood emotions. SPACE is the acronym, that's out of, I want to say Yale, I believe. And same thing, that they've done work with OCD and anxiety disorders that they've shown to be just as effective working exclusively with the parents and caregivers in terms of reduction in symptoms for the child, even though the child doesn't do a single session of therapy. And so to me, this is just the coolest thing, that we could actually not just help the parents and caregivers manage better, but that them being able to manage better has this trickle down effect. So we think about this as cascading attunement, so that when we as providers, like if we think about us being kind of at the top of that waterfall there, when we as providers are able to pour into and get support and skills to parents and caregivers, they can turn around and better support their loved ones, kind of pour into them. And then their loved ones are better able to do the work that we're asking them to do, that we're influencing the whole system when we can get in there and do some of this work with parents and caregivers. And that it can really start with us and our work with the parents. So this is the part I get so excited about and just feels like kind of like magic fairy dust, at least the closest thing that we have to it. And just having, 10 years of doing this work and using these skills and seeing how much this can shift things. And again, how it can start with something that's totally in our control, which is how are we approaching and interacting with these parents and caregivers? So one of the sayings we have in EFFT is dig where the ground is the softest, or like walk through the open door. And often as the provider, you have a very unique and important perspective on the family, and you can use your own experience to bring compassion and empathy to the parents and the caregivers as well as the children. So starting with you. So thinking about that case, client, or situation that you kind of put right at the top of your notebook there, go there in your mind, really put yourself in a tough moment with that case. And I'm going to give you guys a minute to take a look at this. This is something that we call the clinician blocks, and this is an EFFT tool that we use. As you can see, it says it's normal for clinicians to have concerns when making decisions or implementing treatment. How likely are you to feel concerned about each of the following items when making clinical decisions or implementing treatment? And going through and if you're watching at home, feel free to pause this and I'll give you guys a minute. But going through and taking an inventory of, and you don't have to write down each and every one, but kind of noticing for yourself, which are the ones that get the most activated, especially if you're thinking about working with the parents and the caregivers. Do you get worried about being disliked by them? Do you get worried about being disliked by the client if you suggest bringing the parents and the caregivers in? Do you worry about causing suffering to the caregivers or to the client? Especially when we have parents that present as critical or defensive or rejecting even of the child. This fear of bringing the caregiver in because what if it makes it worse? What if we cause suffering to our client, and how scary that is? Going into an emotion and not knowing how to process it, putting a strain on the couple relationship or the child-parent relationship, pushing a caregiver or a client too far and leading to a worsening of symptoms, making decisions that may be unpopular or contrary to the wishes of other team members, which is also so important when you work in a larger team or you work with other providers, bringing in a critical or dismissive caregiver and leading to too much distress for the client. Very often something that comes up when we have a complicated family dynamic, and this idea of like, okay, could we get dad in the room? Can we get mom in the room? What if stepmom shows up, right? And being really fearful about what's that experience going to be like for the client. Having to face my own triggers, vulnerabilities, or wounds along the way. We all have parents and parent histories, if you will, and that can often get activated in being involved in a parent-child relationship. And so what's our own stuff that shows up? Being blamed or being to blame for lack of treatment progress, including having a complaint file, or having some kind of, someone talk to you about your license or litigation, things like that, that can feel really vulnerable for us. Blaming the client or the caregivers for lack of treatment progress, feeling or appearing incompetent or lacking competence. And again, no matter how long you've done this, especially in the face of a caregiver that might come off other blaming, well, who are you and what do you even know? It's easy for that to get activated for all of us. Becoming overwhelmed or burning out, just this idea of I'm already holding so much with this client. What do you mean bringing the family in? What do you mean pulling in the family members that are maybe more on the periphery? Like, oh, I don't know that I have the bandwidth for that, right? Or anything else. So taking a moment, and like I said, pause it if you'd like, and just give yourself a moment to kind of sit with which one of these get activated for you when you think about this specific case. And when we're thinking about those fears and those worries, what are the feelings that come up for you as the provider? Does it feel really scary? I'm worried this client isn't going to get better. Or what if we push them too much? And this is someone that struggled with suicidal ideation. Does this feel safe? You know, the relationship with the parent has been really hostile in the past. You know, is it the right move to bring this person in? It feels really scary, right? There's grief that can be activated on so many levels, you know, feeling grief for the parent or caregiver that might not have a relationship with their child for whatever reason. The grief of the child feeling abandoned or disconnected from the parent or caregiver. The parent or caregiver feeling so much grief around what their child is struggling with and helping them hold that and feeling that. The feeling of helplessness, especially in those really tough, really challenging cases where the system especially feels intense or overwhelming, or we're bumping up against long-standing family dynamics that have been really challenging. How as providers, we can sort of feel like, oh my gosh, what am I gonna do? What can I even do to get in there, right? Some of the shame that can get activated. You know, I've worked with so many providers and done a lot of consultation and supervision, and how often as providers we come to this place of, you know, so-and-so would know what to do with this case, you know, like, or if I was just a better provider, if I just, you know, had more training, or if I had this or that, like, then I would be able to do this, you know, and that shame of feeling like, I don't know if I'm good enough to help. I don't know if I'm good enough to navigate this. The self-blame that can get activated when things aren't going well, and you're going back and you're like, oh, was this the right choice? Should I have done something differently? Like going through your notes, like, oh gosh, 3 months ago, we should have changed course. I see everyone nodding in agreement. Like we've all been there, right? And then just again, especially those really, really challenging cases, that feeling of hopelessness that we are not immune to as providers. And so often being in the place as providers of sometimes we're the only ones that are holding on to the hope. And how hard and heavy and challenging that can be to access when we ourselves are feeling that way. And so noticing how all these feelings show up. And then of course, that little thing on the bottom that says amplified by burnout, which is the more overwhelmed, the more exhausted, the less time for self-care, the more stuff that's going on, you know, in our own lives, be it a flat tire, you know, or just a regular Monday morning, all the way to the bigger, heavier stuff that all of us manage in our lives, in the background when we're not at work, that can really shift how overwhelmed we're feeling and where our bandwidth is, and the way in which as the burnout gets bigger, these feelings feel more and more intense, you know, especially excuse me, we're notorious, I think, as providers for, you know, always advocating for self-care, but not always doing it for ourselves, you know, like, as we all nod and, you know what that is. So just knowing that also plays into it. So thinking about the way that all of these feelings can get really, really activated with these tough cases, and just take a moment, notice which ones are activated in this particular case. And as you're doing this work over time, you'll kind of see, is there a theme? Do you tend to go more towards helplessness? Are you kind of a self-blamer? Everyone has different times where they feel different feelings with all of this. But you might find you sort of cluster around certain narratives that get activated. Same with the clinician traps, just to go back. different cases will push different buttons, if you will, but we tend to kind of have some that tend to be more, sixes and sevens. And it's just so valuable to know, like, oh my gosh, my fear of being disliked is getting activated right now. Okay, great. I'm going to make sure I'm aware of that so it doesn't become something that's sort of operating in my blind spot. So jot down some of those feelings that you notice and take a quick check-in with yourself. Is burnout a component? And so when these feelings get activated, what behaviors tend to follow? And you'll notice very intentionally that this is the top of the tree, that when we were talking about the feelings a moment ago, it's all the roots, right? That the roots sort of give life, if you will, to these behaviors that show up on the top of the tree. The roots are what we don't see always, but the behaviors are what comes out, right? These are the branches, these are the leaves, this is the big trunk, right? And so thinking about yourself in this case, and we just talked through all those clinician traps, all those things that get activated, right? And then all the feelings that can show up amplified by that burnout. And when we're in these spaces, how do we show up? I know we talked at the beginning about how caregivers can show up and we can see them as avoidant or denial or accommodating or other blaming. Now we're kind of taking a step back and saying, oh, when my own fear, grief, shame, self-blame, hopelessness, helplessness, and burnout get activated, what are the ways that I show up? And this is, again, coming to yourself with kindness and compassion, and a lack of judgment as much as is possible. Finding the ways that we can sometimes show up, especially when it comes to interacting with parents and caregivers that are challenging. I have engaged in all of these behaviors, no question. So again, deeply imperfect provider, still learning, always learning, human, right? That avoidance of like, ooh, I don't want to call them back yet. Or I don't know that I want to pull them into a session yet, right? Or doing my own accommodating, the parents really putting the pressure on of saying like, well, are you doing this and doing that? And allowing that to really drive what I'm doing in session, even if like my clinical gut is maybe kind of encouraging me to go in a different way. Being in that place of other blaming other providers. Well, what are they doing? Blaming the parents, blaming the caregivers, even though I philosophically sit firmly in a place where I know and believe in my bones that parents and caregivers do not cause mental health issues, being in that place of like, oh, being in that other blame place. And how often, the longer I've done my own work around this, that when I go to other blame, it's almost always connected with self-blame. That when I'm getting into this place of wanting to kind of point a finger at someone else, like that famous AA saying of like, when you point a finger at someone else, there's 3 other fingers pointing back at you. The way that I know for me, if I'm in this headspace of other blaming, it is deeply connected to my own self-blame and my own sense of inadequacy, my own fear that they're not okay, they're not going to get better. Do I even know what I'm doing? And so when I find myself engaging in that, I have to really pause and say, okay, is there some self-blame here? So just noticing where you tend to go. Do you get overprotective of the client? Do you get really permissive of the client? Do you get defensive with the parent or the caregiver? Do you feel critical of them? Do you avoid them? All these different ways that we can show up as providers when these big feelings get activated. So take a moment and just jot down, on your paper, you've got that case you're thinking of, you've got your clinician traps, right? Like fear of being disliked, fear of going into an emotion and not knowing what to do with it. What are the feelings that come up? And then what are the behaviors that tend to follow? And these are some of our knee-jerk patterns that we tend to go to when the feelings are big. And so we call these blocks in EFFT. And so blocks are a combination of feelings and behaviors that show up when we interact with clients and their loved ones. Caregivers have blocks, and so do providers. So we talk about these as caregiver blocks or clinician blocks or provider blocks. But we use this same map, we use this same tree, whether I'm in supervision with someone and I'm saying, they're coming in and they have a really tough case and they're like, oh, I'm just so frustrated, I don't know what's going on. We pull out the tree and we say, okay, how are you showing up on the top? And then what are the feelings underneath? Or if it's a caregiver and they're like, I just don't want to be involved in treatment. It's like, okay, where is that? Is that avoidant? Is it denial? What's happening here? And can we get underneath that? What are the feelings underneath that? And then coming to the provider at the feelings level. And so this is where we're shifting from this tough caregiver and showing up with all these barriers and obstacles, like getting in the way of treatment, to, okay, time out. If we can look at that and we can get underneath it, we can learn so much about what's happening for this caregiver in the moment that they're really struggling with their loved one. And we can understand where the fear is coming from. And we can bring empathy and compassion to that. We can understand where they're feeling hopeless and sit with them in that so they're less alone. We can see their story of shame and self-blame. And every parent, and I've worked with, probably thousands at this point, every parent I have worked with has some story of shame and self-blame. We taught Adele LaFrance, who was a co-founder of EFFT, will talk about how they've done studies of parents in the NICU. So brand new newborn babies that are in the NICU for whatever reason. And all of these parents have their own narrative and their own story of self-blame of why they're there. This is because I had that turkey sandwich when I was 16 weeks pregnant. This is because, my family has bad genes and I've passed that on, like as if we have any kind of control. I used to give, kind of pre-COVID talks to big groups of parents, all in the same room whose kids were all struggling with various mental health issues. And I would say to them, especially after becoming a parent myself, I would say to them, look, if a meteor hit my kid's daycare right now, I would blame myself. And every parent in the room is like, yes, that makes sense. And I was like, guys, time out. It's a meteor, right? But every one of us just feeling that feeling, and so it is not enough to say to parents, don't blame yourself. You didn't cause this, right? Without going towards their self-blame with empathy and helping them say, like, I know this isn't your fault, but that doesn't mean you believe that. And the way in which self-blame, especially, but any of these feelings, can grab the wheel and start driving the bus for a parent. And then they show up in all these ways that feel kind of wacky, if you will, or problematic or infuriating or whatever. When really we get underneath, it's connected to these big stories of self-blame or of fear or of helplessness or grief or shame, right? And so when we can come to ourselves with this framework and say, oh my gosh, I know I'm avoiding that parent because it's kicking up this sense that I'm not a good enough provider and I feel totally helpless. Then when we see a parent that's avoiding us, we're able to go, I wonder what's underneath. And I wonder how that might be amplified by the burnout that they're feeling. So we come to them with a totally different energy just from that space before we even open our mouth, right? And so why do we have blocks? We have blocks because we're human. I know it sucks. We can't avoid that, right? But we also have blocks because we care. So the bigger the block, the bigger the love that's in the block. It's why we get so activated with our own kids. And we're able to maybe have a little bit more space and distance with our clients because we care about them, but we don't, like, I would throw myself in front of a train, love them the way we do our own kids, which is why I can know this stuff and live and breathe it and teach it all day long, and then go home and it all flies out the window with my own children because it's all just more intense. And so whenever I see the tree, I also sort of imagine there's like a little heart in the middle, that all of this, everything that shows up on this piece of paper in this tree, from the feelings to the behaviors, is because there's love there. And so when we see a parent that's really in denial or really accommodating or really other blaming, it's because there's so much love there. And so again, also being able to hold space for that in the same way that when we show up with all these behaviors, it's because we care. If we didn't care, whatever, do whatever you want, like, slide off my back, like we wouldn't have all the feelings on the bottom, right? And so know that it comes from our care, but also that there's wisdom in this. And so the parent that is accommodating, rather than throw that out the window of like, nope, this is the plan. We said we were going to do X, Y, Z. You're being non-compliant, to say like, tell me what feels hard about this. Tell me what you're scared of. And that I say to parents, I'm like, it's like we're mining this for gold. And so we've got like one of those sifters, like in the river, and we're trying to let all the rocks sort of fall through the little cracks. And we're trying to keep the gold of what is the gold here. And so a parent that's accommodating, that has a fear of pushing their child too far, tell me more about that so we can understand. Maybe we started too big. Maybe if we're on that hierarchy, we're starting at a 6 or a 7 and we need to drop it to a 3 so we can build more sense of confidence for you and your child, right? If it's avoidant, so often the parents that show up as avoidant, when we kind of dig in, their tank is empty. They are just like 0 out of 0, 0 out of 100 in terms of self-care. And that the avoidance is protective. It's the part of them that's saying like, this is too much. I can't handle this. I need to take care of myself before I can go back in. And so great, let's figure out how to do that. Let's figure out how to resource you. Let's get you a break so that you can then get back in there in the way that you want to be able to parent, right? And so with awareness, our blocks can alert us to our struggles, but also to our wisdom and to our love and to our care, which is all so, so important. So we often walk people through this. And when we're in a big group, we'll all kind of stand up and say this out loud so we can own it, So take a moment and pen to paper this, and I'll start. I am Bryn. I have blocks, both as a clinician and as a parent, right? But as a provider, I'll keep a case in mind right now. When I feel fear, helplessness, and self-blame, that's like a trifecta for me, I've found over the years, I tend to get avoidant and accommodating. And that can be with parents, that can be with the client, they can show up in a lot of different ways. But it's things that I have to keep an eye out for myself, right? And again, it can be an opportunity for me to kind of take a time out and say, what am I feeling here? Because if I'm showing up in these ways, it's because there's something going on underneath that I need to acknowledge. I need to give some space to. And so when we can articulate this, and so we used to sit in team meeting and do this with 40 people in the room and raise their hands, and we would say like, okay, I feel blocked. Like I have to go have this tough conversation with this mom that's really in a tough spot, and I am feeling totally hopeless, and it's getting me into this place where I'm doing a lot of other blaming. And everyone's like, oh, we get it. Makes sense. Like, what do you need from us? Right. And so I love this as a language, both for yourself to kind of walk yourself through it, but also to share with your supervisor, with your colleagues, with your peers, that it can really become this way for us to normalize this. And also sort of start to sift through and find the gold of what's the part of this that's the wisdom, and what's the part of this that we can let go of, that we don't need the fear driving the bus. So, okay, I get it. I have blocks. Now what? Notice when they show up. Awareness is a huge, huge piece of this. Come to yourself with kindness and compassion. Again, this is here because you care, because it matters to you. Share it with a peer or a supervisor, share it with your team, and extra credit. Think about how this works with your peers. And this could be these other providers. This could be other people on your team. This could be the provider that you're like, they won't call me back, or they're doing this thing that's crazy, or that thing that's crazy. Like, kind of sitting with it and saying, okay, what could be underneath this for them, and then being able to come to these other providers with more empathy and compassion and more understanding. So all of this is one of the parts of Recognize, which is my 5-step program that I work with parents. And so just like we walked through all of those steps as we do with providers, we do the exact same thing with parents so that they can start to be aware of when I'm showing up with my child and I'm accommodating, I immediately can go to like, okay, this is my fear and my self-blame. What do I need to do to regulate, to take care of myself, to connect to the parent I want to be so that I can respond more effectively with my loved one in that moment? And so all of this is part of this Recognize, this step 1, where we help parents have a better sense of what's going on for them so that they can better regulate in the moment, so they can come to their child and be calm in these really challenging moments. They can connect with their values. Who do I want to be for my child when they struggle? And sometimes, the things that parents have come up with in those moments are so beautiful that they can anchor and ground themselves in so that they can then respond effectively. And then after that, they can refuel. And I don't talk to parents and caregivers anymore about self-care because they just everyone's like, who has time for a bubble bath? And I'm like, no, this isn't a bubble bath. I'm talking about when your car is on empty, you're going to get stuck on the side of the road. When your tire is flat, you don't try and drive on it. You get it fixed, right? You stop at the gas station and you fill your tank up because the alternative is breaking down on the side of the road, right? And so we need to really paradigm shift around this is not optional. This is non-negotiable. This is refueling. And then the last step is reflecting and repeating. How did it go? What went well? What do I want to learn? And then repeating is all about holding the hope and not giving up. And that we get the opportunity to do this again and again and again every time our child struggles. And when we can help caregivers, this is back to that like cascading attunement. When we can help caregivers see tough moments with their child as an obstacle, as an opportunity instead of an obstacle, in the same way that when we can have a tough caregiver in front of us and say, oh my gosh, there is such an opportunity here. This is someone that loves their child so much. And if we can leverage that and we can direct that energy into supporting them in a way that feels more effective like this, oh my gosh, like we can move mountains. This is the magic fairy dust, right? And so and then having those parents turn around and say, oh my gosh, my kid's struggling. Great. I get to use all my tools and skills and show up in a different way for them that's more supportive and more effective and more in alignment with what they need and the parent that I know I want to be. Because I know that's the parent that they need, right? And so we're shifting these tough moments into opportunities. And so one last thing that I always say to providers is when you talk in EFFT about this idea of 1 degree. And so I'm talking magic fairy dust and moving mountains, and that's always the goal. We always shoot for the moon, right? But that even a small shift can chart a totally new course. So if you're in an airplane, if you're on a boat, and you set your course, but you miss it by 1 degree, you're on a totally different trajectory over time. And so even a slight change for parents and caregivers, even if you never show them the tree, even if you never talk to them about caregiver blocks, but you just conceptualize it in your moments of struggle with them, you're already bringing a different energy that is more than a 1 degree shift. And that can have a massive impact over time. So in terms of how to kind of continue to do this work, or if you're curious about it, or you want to get this to parents or caregivers, I have a couple different ways to do it. And then I'll pass it to Colleen and open it up for questions and all of that. But I have some free resources for both providers and parents and caregivers. So at my website, brynmillercoaching.com, there's a free monthly newsletter that I send out that has kind of concrete, actionable skills each month, and then a bunch of free resources. So podcasts, articles, support groups, different things that are helpful for parents. So it's a great thing you can just, as a provider, kind of forward along to parents. And then I also have downloadable trainings, a number of them. One of them is called Build Your Yardstick, which is all about helping parents set goals that are within their control, so that they can feel more effective as they're supporting their child. So shifting, and one of the components of that is, how do you approach these moments with your child, not as an obstacle or an obligation, but as an opportunity, and how does that shift things? So that's one of the ones that's sort of built into that. And there's a downloadable training with a companion workbook for parents. So that's all at my website. And then I also do this work with parents. So I'm able to, through my coaching umbrella, work with families all over the country, all over the world. And so I have an on-demand course that's the response roadmap that you can download and access on your own time in the middle of the night, and take it on walks with you, that's totally private and walks you through all of these steps. And then I also do a course in a cohort. It's an 8-week program where I walk a really small, intimate group of parents and caregivers through the course module by module, and we meet once a week, and then you do the module on your free time, and then we come in and kind of hands-on sort of play with it, and then you go do the next module, so on and so forth, for 8 weeks. And then I also do one-on-one coaching, where we use the course, and I can really kind of custom fit that to families that are looking for that really super hands-on support. So that's all my stuff. Gives you guys just hopefully a taste of this work and how powerful it can be, how helpful it can be, and how valuable it can be to providers and families. So I will stop talking now and open it up to questions, and just want to thank Heart and Solutions and Colleen and everyone for having me here and giving me the opportunity to do this. So I look forward to staying in touch, and reach out if you need anything.
Absolutely. Bryn, I feel like that hour went so fast. I'm like, no, like, please, I need more. I need more.
I know, it goes so fast, doesn't it? At least I think it does.
Definitely. And yeah, thinking about, as a licensure supervisor, right? I was like, oh, I love those points of the cascading attunement, right? And the clinician trap scale, and the trees, like, yes, like I want to go around group, right? And talk about those blocks. So really great information there, and being able to walk away with things and next steps, right? Of, okay, how do I implement this? So thank you so much. You've done a great job explaining all of the resources that you have available. For those that are watching this as a recording, they're in our show notes. So please check that out. We will have links to Bryn's website so that you can get access to all of the things that she has talked about here. So again, we are so appreciative of everything that you have shared with us today, and cannot thank you enough. So thank you to everybody who joined us live. Those of you that are watching this recording, thank you so much. And don't forget that you need a training.
Thank you for joining in on today's training. We look forward to having you join us again. Heart and Solutions is proud to provide CE-eligible trainings for our counseling community. This training may be eligible for continuing education credit hours through either the National Board for Certified Counselors, provider number 7376, or the Association of Play Therapy, provider number 21-645. To obtain CE hours for today's training, be sure to follow the steps in the description below.